done for me lately? It's Coons. What have y'all done for us lately? And if there's no answer, the only thing we owe them.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk To, as well as Dr. Winter's channel. And tonight, I have the pleasure of having a chat with Dr. Winters, who is our historian, our elder historian, someone who allows himself to be very available for us common folk. He's one of the people who's, in my opinion, he allows us to learn according to our speed and doesn't give us too much that we can't handle and get all spooky and scared with it. So tonight we're going to have a conversation because a lot of people have said they don't believe in the transatlantic slave trade because they don't see the ships. Where's the ships? Where's all these ships that people were bought over? They should be archived. They should have been somewhere. We know that they just recently found a ship, I think in 2020, the last ship they said on the coast of Alabama somewhere. I don't know if that's valid, but that's what they said. So we have our historian here to explain what was the transatlantic slave trade and how and why we may not have any ships here. What's up, Dr. Winters?
What up, though? I'm very excited to be here, Q, because this is an interesting topic. Because many of the Aboriginal brothers, the Moors, and the Aboriginal brothers, the Moors, the Hebrews, they all claim in a sense that that they couldn't. No black people came over from Africa, mainly because there was no slave ships or there were few slave ships. But what they don't understand is that what they're doing is that they're trying to run away from two things. They're trying to run away from our African ancestry, and they're trying to run away from being called black. You know what I'm saying? And they feel, because of the fact they have such an inferiority complex, because they feel ashamed of themselves and ashamed of their moms and dads, they feel in the sense that if you call them black, something is wrong with them, you see, I grew up in a mixed family. Half of my brothers, half of us was high yellow, like my father, and the rest of us happened to be dark, like my mom. But it's very interesting that when I was young, I was kind of light-skinned. See how I said skinned it instead of light-skinned? I was light-skinned when I was young.
So you started getting blackety black as you got older.
Yes. The older I got, the more knowledge I got, the more I started learning about our history and our culture. I got blacker and blacker. And so, hey, the blacker the berry, what do they say? The blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice, baby. Hey. So, but again, this is a complicated issue. So why did you come up with this topic?
Well, a friend of mine, she calls herself the anti-influencer. She had posted on her page, "Where are the ships? Something don't sound right." And I believe that she was trying to get the information, and you see a lot of that nowadays, where people are learning about knowledge of self and learning about their history, and some of their history, oral history that was passed down, some of their families used to tell them like, we don't know nothing about slavery in our lineage. So I think when they hear that from oral tradition from their grandparents, great grandparents, and then they're taught in some of these schools that we all came from Africa and we all came from the ships, I think they feel like, and rightfully so, this is the oppressor's educational system. They lied. And definitely when you have, in their opinion, no physical evidence to say that we were brought over here, even though you may see pictures in over there, the point of no return, you see the dungeons and the chains over there. You don't see no physical stuff over here in their eyes. They may have never been to the museum or something. So I thought this would be a great topic for you to educate us, teach us, guide us, and show us where we could find out this type of information so we don't be confused about what happened.
Mm-hmm. Well,
because Dr. Winters, what a lot of us don't understand, excuse me for cutting you off, slavery was a very, very small part of our history.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to make it seem like that was our history. So I think that some of us sometimes can't get past like the slavery part.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very difficult because, yes, we suffered 250 years of slavery, but some people say 300, 500, 600. But it was a minute time in our history. But the problem is that it had a great effect on us, When I was growing up, my mom and dad, they didn't want to talk about slavery. They didn't even want to talk about sharecropping. The only thing my father and them would talk about, my father, all he talked about was sneaking into the white man field, stealing some watermelons and eating them, and jumping out of girl windows at night. So all I knew about the South was, hey, let's jump in those girls' window, and when they dad and mom get home, jump out and hide under the porch.
It's hot, and it's swampy waters. We don't want to talk about down there. My grandmother was the same way. She would not talk about it. She hated the thought of it. And my grandparents, they moved to Chicago and then they moved to New Jersey. Okay. My grandfather would speak of it in ways of, he'd always laugh and be like, I came from a big family. I didn't have it hard. But he would say, like, if he wasn't a somebody or related to a bunch of people, it was hard for some people coming out of slavery.
Yeah, it was very hard because, see, the problem is what we have here, Q, is that we didn't have just one Atlantic slave trade. We had 3 Atlantic slave trades. What many people don't know is that as early as 1496, and by at least 1507, the English was already going up and down the coast of America. And when they were going up and down the coast of North America, they would attack Black Indian villages, and they would kidnap the people. And when they kidnapped these people, they would usually, in a sense, sell them into slavery. They specialized in kidnapping Black women. How you doing, Black? They specialized in stealing Black women because they would put Black women in brothels over there in England. Yes. They were selling the brothels in England, Spain. So there was an intimate relationship between many Indian groups and, Aboriginal Indian groups and the English. And one of the things is that many of these Indians, especially some in Virginia, they wouldn't even deal with white folks. And when you read about these Black Indians, you find out that these Black Indians, they never saw Caucasians. How you doing, Foster? They never saw Caucasians as being human beings. They never saw them as being human beings. They felt that there's no way that they could do the things they do and be human beings. In fact, we had a tradition back in the day that our Aboriginal ancestors, my mom, she told me when I was in high school and all that type of stuff that I was part of Choctaw and all that good stuff. But every Mississippi person, I guess, was. You had
that good head too, huh?
Yeah. Oh, I had a little bit sticks up. Woo, woo, woo. A little bit of good hair, keep it greased up, and so. But what happened is that many of these Aboriginals, because I call the Black Indians Aboriginals, because the Red Indians, they call themselves Native Americans. And so if you want to differentiate between the red Indians and the black Indians, we call the red Indians Native Americans, the black Indians we call Aboriginals. So what would happen is that many of the Aboriginal blacks, they used to feel that if you met somebody, you should give them a gift. And so the English would give them gifts, but they usually gave them gifts that were smallpox blankets.
Mm.
In other words, in the sense, they would get a blanket that they had put over somebody with smallpox, and then they would give it to the Indian. And you know, the Indians, remember, they would wear shawls around themselves. And they would have pins to stick them together on the shoulder. And so then they would get these blankets, and after a while, many of these blankets, in a sense, would lead to them catching smallpox. And if you notice, that's why the Europeans would sometimes, when the English first settled in the Americas, they came in the fall and spring because they already knew they had cabins to live in. See, because the Aboriginals, they lived in wooden houses, you know, thatched roofs, but they lived in wooden houses. They had palisades or forts around their settlements. You see, whereas the Red Indians, they were nomadic, and the Red Indians, they lived in teepees because they moved from place to place. You see. So then the Aboriginal blacks, when they first came in contact with the English and the Spanish, they tried to be their friends. But as I said, they began, in a sense, to kidnap Black Indian tribes, and then they sold them as slaves in Europe, you know. And so then many of these Aboriginals became sex workers until they died of syphilis and all that type of stuff, because Europeans spread syphilis. Okay, so what we find is this. Let's get into the transatlantic slave trade. The first Atlantic slave trade began in 1625. And in 1625, King Charles, he sold into chattel slavery. Let me explain to you, family. Chattel slavery, it means that he sold these people as personal property. Okay, because he sold these people as personal property, the chattel slave had less rights. Listen to me. They had less rights than the cattle, the horses, and the pigs on a farm.
Mm.
They had less rights because there was no laws for these chattel slaves. And so King Charles, what he did is that over in England, back in the day, the UK, they were having what was called religious wars. And we noticed, in a sense, is that many of the Irish, the Black Irish, because Britain was originally occupied by none but Black people. You see, we know the earliest evidence of these Black people in Britain goes back to 22,000 BC. Then we know that the Phoenicians, they came to Ireland and the British Isles in search of tin, and then later the Egyptians, and then later the Picts, the so-called Picts, who were supposed to be the little small people that used to rule in the British Isles. These were what we call today the Anu people. And the Anu people, they represent the Twa, or the pygmies that we see in Central Africa, yes. Although today we see these pygmies in Central Africa, we see these people, in a sense, as hunters and gatherers. We see them walking around with big stomachs and walking around singing. But at one time, these Anu people, they ruled the world. Mm. They built gigantic ships, you see, and they had colonies throughout on every continent. And so these Picts, they're called Picts, Picts. And these Picts, what they did is that they built the first pyramids and the first mounds over in Europe. And in fact, the Egyptians, they tell us that the Anu people, or what the people we call Twa today, or the Pygmies, they tell us that the Anu people were the first people who built the Egyptian civilization, that built the pyramids. You see, they also, in a sense, were the founders of Sumerian civilization. But let's get back to England. Okay, so these Black people have been living in England for thousands of years. Many of these black people in Ireland, these Black Irish, what happened is that during the Roman period, when there was a war with the Romans, they fought the Romans for about 100 years. The Romans could never conquer these Black people. And so then what happened is that many of them became Catholics. And because they became Catholics, that meant that they had a lot of money. They built the castles. You see, when you look at family, when you look at the tower, when you look at, in a sense, the Tower of London, when you look at the bridge, when you look at the British bridges, when you look at those buildings, they go back to the medieval period. They were designed and built by Black architects, by Black engineers. Okay, and so what happened is that so they went to war. Many of the Black Protestants, they were kind of poor. They didn't have that much money, but they had soon developed, in a sense, a powerful business class, mercantile class that included a whole lot of Black Protestants. And so these Black Protestants, they went to war against the Black Irish. It was, who were Catholics. See, that's one of the reasons why today I don't say I belong to any religion. I believe in God. I hold God as my creator. I believe Jesus Christ, Muhammad, all that stuff. But I never identify with a religion, because religions have been our downfall. And because religion has been our downfall, I try not to subscribe to any religion, See, because the thing is, this is that all of this brings about division. We see the Catholics fighting the Baptists or other Protestant groups. None of us like Jehovah's Witnesses. Don't come over my house this Saturday, please. And then you look at the Muslims. You got the Sunni fighting the Shiites. You look over there in India. You got the Aryan Hindus fighting the South Indian black Hindus. And so then religion is just complicated. So what King Charles did is that they had a little fight, and so he sent 25,000. He sent 25,000 Black Irishmen from Ireland to the 13 colonies and the Caribbean. Okay. Many of these Black Irishmen, they were on these plantations as chattel slaves, you see. Then they had another war, and many Protestants was killed when they tried to take over the capital, Ulster, the capital of Ireland. After this, Oliver Cromwell, he was the leader of the Parliament. He was another Black guy. He looked like, he looked like, well, he was the average looking brother, except he had straight hair. And so what happens is that Oliver Cromwell, he attacked the Black Irish Catholics, and then he began to send 50,000 Black Irishmen into slavery in the Caribbean and the 13 colonies between 1650 and 1659. He died around 1659. Okay, so what happened is this. So the first chattel slaves were Irish. And so the first Atlantic slave trade was between, you would catch a ship, leave from Boston or somewhere in Virginia or North Carolina. You catch a ship, you would ride on that ship up to Liverpool in England. And then when you got to Liverpool in England, or you would go directly to Ireland, you would get these Black Irish slaves and you would put them on these slave ships, you see. And because they would put them on these slave ships, you see, they were taken to the Americas. And so what happened is that many of these Black Irishmen, they were already on the plantation beginning in 1625. Okay.
Sister Eve, our Wazee sister.
Oh yeah, Eve. We're gonna do a show tomorrow.
Hey, you guys in the chat, if you have any questions for Dr. Winters, I'll star them and I'll ask Dr. Winters towards the end of the conversation. I'll make sure that we get through every question before we close out. We're definitely going to try to get to them. Okay, so then at the same time they were putting these Black Irishmen on the plantation as chattel slaves, they began to say, hey, they began to grow tobacco. And as they began to grow tobacco, they needed more laborers because they couldn't put any people in a sense on the plantations to work as slaves because of the fact that they were already Christians. They couldn't make them slaves. They already took just about everybody from Ireland, Black Irish who were Catholics, and they were already enslaved on the plantation. So what they did is that they began, in a sense, to fight wars with the Indians, the Black Indians. When they fought wars with the Aboriginal Indians,
That meant in a sense that beginning in 1634, I tell you how the first black Irish, 25,000 of them were made chattel slaves in 1625. So 9 years later in 1634, they began in a sense to attack. They began to get niggas. I'm sorry. They began to get Aboriginal black people to fight against each other, and then the white man would stir up a little battle and had these black people fight each other, and then he would say, "Hey, we can take those people who lost off your hand." And so what he would do is that often he would take the Aboriginal women, and he would make them slaves because the white man said that women worked better. They were better farmers. Women usually have a green thumb. So they were better farmers than the men. So what they would do is they'd usually, not always, but usually they would take the Aboriginal women and they would put them on the plantation. And they would send the Aboriginal men to Bermuda, Jamaica. That's why they were many of the Maroons. Many of the Maroons in Jamaica and Bermuda, they came from here. They were black Indians. They came from here, and they the ones started that shit. Even though they always play up, even though they always try to make it look like it was mainly African Maroons, no. The majority of the first Maroons in Jamaica, Bermuda, they were mainly, in a sense, Aboriginal Indians. So between 1634 and 1660, the only people on the plantations were black Irish and Aboriginal women and men. So what happened is that many of the black Irish and many of the Indians made it. And as they made it, they began to start families. And so then the children in a sense, they would be maybe named Winters. They would maybe be named McLean based upon their Irish parents.
The Irish roots.
What's that? Yeah.
The Irish roots.
But what happened is that until I think it was about 1660, 1670, often the slave, now this is it, often the slave parent, the parent, if the female wasn't a slave, or even if the female was a slave, their offspring would become free. That's how we began to see a lot of black Indians being named Winters, McLean, Crawford. You see, because many of these black Indians who had married Irish, once they ran away from the plantation or they had children, their children would go back to the Indian village, black Indian village. When they would go back to the Aboriginal village, they would marry Indians, and in turn, you would see, in a sense, these black people with Irish names. You see, and that's one of the reasons why you see all this stuff. These Irish people, okay. So then we had that was the second Atlantic slave trade. The second Atlantic trade involved the English kidnapping or defeating Aboriginal Indians in wars, and then they would take these Aboriginal Indians, and then they would take them from North America to the Caribbean or London, and then back. So they would take the slaves, in a sense. When they talk about, they always taught us this lie. They taught us this lie that they first broke the slaves in the Caribbean and then brought them over here from the Caribbean. That's a lie. The Caribbean, they never had enough slaves to work the plantation. So if a slave got there, then in a sense, then that slave stayed there. And so then the second Atlantic slave trade was Aboriginal Indians being sold as slaves, in the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean back to America, make some rum, grow some sugar cane. They would grow sugar cane in the Caribbean. They would take the sugar from the Caribbean and they would take it back to the Americas. And then, in a sense, they would collect slaves and they would make rum. And then they would take the rum and maybe some of the Aboriginal slaves back from America to the Caribbean. That was the second Atlantic slave trade. So between 1625 and 1660, the only chattel slaves were, in a sense, Black Irish, and Aboriginals. Okay, what happened in a sense is that they began to grow rice, they began to grow sugar, and tobacco was one of the main crops. Tobacco, and sugar cane. But they mainly grew sugar cane in the Caribbean. They tried to grow some cane here, but over here was mainly tobacco and rice and stuff like that. And so what happened is that by 1660, they didn't have enough, in a sense, indentured servants to work on the plantations, because see, the indentured servants, they were free after 7 years. And because they were free after 7 years, what happened in a sense is that they were losing a lot of employees. So what they did is that they decided that they were going to make the African indentured servants into chattel slaves. So beginning by around 1670, they began, in a sense, to make African indentured servants slaves, and they began to go directly to Africa, to bring slaves from Africa to the Americas, to North America. And so that was the third Atlantic slave trade between America, Africa, the Caribbean, America, Caribbean, Africa, because they were producing rum. So we find, in a sense, that the first chattel slaves were Black Irish. The second chattel slaves were Aboriginals. And the third chattel slaves were sub-Saharan Africans. Okay. All right. So
everybody got that, family? I hope everybody got that. And Dr. Winters gave us the dates and everything on when everything happened, because most people think it was just one time or just one small 100-year, 200-year window. But Dr. Winters explained how it was a 300-year window right there.
Right. And so then what happened is so beginning in 1700 is when the African slave trade became very influential. And so they began to bring more and more African slaves, more and more enslaved people from Africa. But remember, family, you had to understand this. Among those Black Irish, you had most of the musicians, you had most of the preachers, you had most of the people who used to play organ. You know how we love the organ? We got that from our Irish background. Playing trumpet, playing trombone. They're playing all these things, and they kicked all of them out. The musicians, they kicked engineers. Can you imagine? They had engineers. In fact, many Black Irish ended up being the slaves of people who took their land over in England. Yeah. And so then we find, in a sense, and what made it so bad is that, so we find out in the 1700, they began, in a sense, to import a lot of African slaves. But you got to remember, family, is that mostly all these, they only was allowed to have African slaves. They only were allowed to import African slaves up until the Revolutionary War, because after the Revolutionary War, they passed a law. That they couldn't import slaves from Africa unless they snuck them in. So by 1807, the Atlantic slave trade between North America and Africa, it was kind of supposedly ended, but they still did stuff undercover, because Q already told you about the Clotilda. The Clotilda was a slave ship, and it landed off Mobile, Alabama, and in a sense, it brought 110 slaves. These were the last. They claimed the last African slaves sold in the Americas in 1860. And these people, in a sense, they later became free. Okay, so they could import slaves up to the 1800s. So what happened is that the majority of foundational Black Americans are mainly descendants of people from the Senegambia. That means most of us came from Senegal, the Sahel, and we came from Gambia. That's because of the fact is that many of the slave coasts, like the slave coast in Elmina, hardly any of us came from that slave thing, because they didn't start importing lots of slaves from there until after they stopped the slave trade over here. That's why when they tell you that you got Yoruba and Hausa and you got Congo, when they tell you got Yoruba, Hausa, and Congo, ancestry, they're lying to you, because most of those people wasn't brought to America. Now, some of them were brought to Louisiana. Now, if your ancestry goes back to Louisiana, then you may have ancestors who are Yoruba, Hausa, Akan, and all that type of stuff. But for the vast majority of us whose ancestors came from Virginia and North Carolina, our ancestors are mainly Senegamian. Okay, because of the fact, in a sense, that they only had slavery for a limited amount of time, they claim that 366,000 African slaves were sold in North America. Okay, but see, remember, although there was 366,000, there was millions of Black Aboriginals living in Virginia and North Carolina. You see, and all the way up to Maine and stuff like that. And so when many people, over the years, I've had students in my class, and many people say, Dr. Winters, my parents were never slaves, and my parents were Choctaw, they were never slaves, or they were Cherokee. My family were Irish, they were never slaves.
They from Nova Scotia.
Yeah, they were telling the truth. They weren't never slaves, because the fact, in a sense, is that we had a very Black middle class. In fact, this Black middle class of Black Europeans, none of them were enslaved, and their descent goes back. I know you've heard of the Huguenots, the Jacobites, the Sephardic Jews or crypto Jews, the crypto Moors. All these people, in a sense, were Black people. Yes, the Huguenots. The Huguenots were Black. The Jacobites were Black. But in the books, they show you a picture of some white person. That's Rothschild. No, it's not the real Rothschild. The real Rothschild was a nigga. I mean, the real Rothschild was a...
Yes.
Anyway. And so what you find, in a sense...
He was a GCP, huh?
Yeah, it was kind of sad, because many of these rich Black people who would come from Norway, because what happened is that, okay, many of the so-called Danes, the people from Switzerland, the people from Norway, the people from Germany, many of these people, in a sense, they were descendants of the Moors. That's why if you remember, well, maybe you wouldn't remember, but Benjamin Franklin in 1751, he wrote a paper, and in the paper he said that there are very few white people on earth. He said the vast majority of people, the Germans, yes, the Germans, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, they were all Black, he said. And they were Black. Many of them were Black then. But see, what happened is that over time, as over here in America, we started talking about the white man. And because Americans invented the white man, and other Black people started marrying light-skinned people and stuff like that. For example, my aunt, my grandma, my wife, beautiful to me, my wonderful one was beautiful. I know when my grandma said, I like Diane, but couldn't you find somebody a little lighter? I'm sorry, Grandma, I disappointed you. Yes, I disappointed her. My cousins Ernie, my cousins Ernie, Johnny Jr., they found the light. They were light too, but they were on the winter side. Everybody's real light skinned. They went and found some real good white girls. Sadly for us, we just married the prettiest girls, dark or light skinned. And so then what happened, in a sense, is that they brought these people. Okay, around 1750, 1796. I know you've seen pictures of those slave ships, and these slave ships have these rows and rows of Black people. They didn't start building those slave ships, and I think until after 1797, because see, originally any ship that could carry cargo was a slave ship. They didn't just have specialized ships to bring slaves.
I think people think nowadays they was on Carnival Cruise Line or something.
Yeah, they wasn't on Carnival Cruise. See, any ship any ship that you could carry cargo on, you would maybe, in a sense, you would maybe, kidnap some black people, put them on there, And so what happened in a sense is that this is why you don't find any slave ships. Then plus, as the slave ships, as after the end of slavery, many of the slave ships were in a sense reconstructed. They took away some of the stuff that they had for slaves so that they could take on other cargo. The last slave trip was the Cotilda, and the Cotilda, they found that ship off of around Mobile, Alabama. The Cotilda, I think they had 110 people that enslaved people from Africa, and then what happened in a sense is that it was against the law, so they burned the ship down and left it, because it was really against the, wink wink, it was against the law, and so they burned the ship, and that's where the last slave ship is. That would show the design that we frequently see. But that design that we frequently see of the slave ship and just slaves all over the place and slaves in rows and slaves on different decks, those ships were not made until the 1790s. And by 1860, those ships were reconstituted so they could carry a regular cargo. See, okay, and so many black people, see, the European, the white man has taught us that we have no agency. We have no agency. He wants to make it look as though we got everything from him, you see. In fact, he even tries to tell us that we got our surnames. We got our surnames from our slave masters. That's a lie. Think about it. If the slave master didn't respect you, why would he want you to carry his name? Just think. No, he didn't carry it. We already had these names, and many of these names we got because of the fact, in a sense, of our Irish ancestry and the Irishmen who married Aboriginal Indians and who married sub-Saharan Africans when they came onto the plantation. See, because we had very stable plantations until after 1807. After 1807, they began what was called the interstate slave trade. And as they began interstate slave trade, they began to sell slaves from West Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, well, the Carolinas, and Virginia. They began to sell them into the Deep South, you see. And as they began to sell them into the Deep South, then therefore, in a sense, there was an expansion of the older slave population down throughout the South. States like Maryland, they became slave breeding states. That's why you find today a lot of people from Virginia, not Virginia, a lot of people from Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland. A lot of times they have a lot of incest.
Blue people. That's what the blue people is from Kentucky. They blue.
Yeah,
well, you ever look it up? They blue. They people blue.
They may be blue, but a lot of people from those states, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, you'll find a lot of times that the families have a tradition of incest, where you find the mothers, brothers, fathers, sisters, cousins, having intercourse with each other.
Yeah.
You have a lot of incest, but that came from the fact is that these were slave breeding states, and because they were slave breeding states, traditionally they were states in the sense where you were a motherfucker. You fuck your mama, your sister, your brother, whatever, you see. And so then, okay, and so a lot of people, I hear a lot of people always say, Dr. Short, I'm tired of that nigga. He got cousins and family all over the place. How he get these cousins and families all over the place? Dr. Short, you're lying. Dr. Short is not lying. Let me explain to you. Since most of our family, even my family, even though in a sense, the last place that my parents, my great grandparents lived was in Mississippi, they came from North Carolina. Okay, so people from North Carolina and Virginia, they were sold as slaves to people in Mississippi, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, and places like that. So now you think about this. Let's say that the Winters in North Carolina had 10 kids. Out of those 10 kids, each one of those kids would have been sold to a different state, Mississippi, Alabama, right? So then if each one of those kids would have been sold to a different state, then that would have meant in a sense that it was winters in Mississippi, winters in Alabama, winters in Texas that were related to me. But what if they married a Crawford? Then they became related. And then what if the ones who married a Crawford married in a sense a McCain? Do you see how that spread and how so many of us have relationships? And when you start to study our ancestry and you go through genealogies, you find that we were spread all over the place because of the fact of the interstate slave trade. Because the interstate slave trade sold, in a sense, people. Also, the interstate slave trade had a very disastrous effect on foundational Black Americans. The effect was that the average slave was sold at the age of 5 years old. So if the average slave was sold at the age of 5, they wouldn't know too much about their history, right? You see? But most of the time, the women, they remained on the plantations. That's why in Africa, they have these people who carry the oral tradition. These people who carry the oral tradition are called the Jolie or the Griot. Among us, among foundational Black Americans, our Jolies or Griots are our grandmas and our aunties. And see, the grandmas and aunties, because they weren't sold as often, maybe, then they would sometimes be able to relay the transition to their daughters and maybe even to their sons. And so again, when people say, where are the slave ships? The slave ships after the slave trade were converted into regular ships to carry in a sense regular cargo. And many of the ships that engaged in the Atlantic slave trade were not outfitted. They didn't look like those slave ships that you see published in these books today. Many of these slave ships, yeah, it was some that was like that, but the majority of slave ships was a ship that a person could just throw some Black people on, and then in a sense, they would bring them to America and make some money. Okay, now you're saying, Dr. Winters, you said that the Europeans did not get slaves from the Caribbean. They said you're lying because the white folks said that they did get slaves from the Caribbean, and that these were seasoned slaves, and that these seasoned slaves were taught how to be, in a sense, how to behave after they had been on plantations in the Caribbean. That's a lie. Let me explain to you what they did. Many states like Virginia, Maryland, and other places, they made it against the law to sell Aboriginals as slaves. So
the key word he's using, everybody, is Aboriginals.
Yeah, the Aboriginals. It was against the law to sell Aboriginals as slaves. So anytime the Caucasians needed some new labor, because the Aboriginal Indians were Black, just like the Black Irish and the Black Africans, you couldn't tell no difference. So what many Caucasians would do is that they would attack an Indian village, kill as many people as they can, and then all the people who was left alive, they would put them on a ship, and then they would take their boat and ride to Bermuda. And then they would go to Bermuda, and they would come back to America and say, "Hey, we brought these slaves from Bermuda." And even though they would say, "Oh, no, I can't." That's why you find there's many cases where people, in a sense, were able to free their children who had been kidnapped in that way. And so again, number one, the first Atlantic slave trade was a trade between England and the planters in the 13 colonies in Black Irish. The second Atlantic slave trade involved, in a sense, Aboriginals or Black Indians who were sold into slavery. I think they said about 300,000 Aboriginals were sold into slavery. And these people either were placed on plantations in the South and on farms in the North, or sold to the Caribbean. Then the third transatlantic slave trade involved bringing Africans over here. Okay, many people who say that their family were never slaves, they're not lying. Their families, they come from families who may have been Black Europeans or Indians who weren't enslaved. And see, many Black Europeans were many black Europeans, they form the Boule today. These black people, I'm not going to call them foundational black Americans because these people, in a sense, are descendants of slaves. These black people had plenty of money. In fact, some of them even engaged in the slave trade. Some of them would rent a boat, they'd get a boat, and then they go over and kidnap some Africans, bring them over here, make some money, and then start other businesses. Other people, in a sense, would have black slaves, but they would buy their family members or their cousins and stuff like that. So it's a very interesting thing. But if you're looking for slave ships, you're not going to find any. They didn't think that was so significant, so they didn't put one in a museum, you see. And I don't even see why people would be interested in them. But anyway.
Let me ask you a question, Dr. Winters, and I hope this isn't too far off the topic before we get to the questions that I started in the chat. During this time, when did they come up with the social construct of race?
They came up with the social construct of race. You got to understand this. You see, they always called the Indians copper colored, but when they described them as being blacks. See, but this is it: is that in the beginning, most of the relationships between people was based on their nationality. If you came from Britain or Ireland, you was Irish, or you were British, or you were Hessian, or you were German. If you were an Aboriginal, you were called in a sense, Choctaw Creek, Yushi, Manican, Menocan, all that. You were called by your nationality. Now, people from Africa, they didn't call people from Africa based upon their country of origin. Sometimes they would record them from their nationality when they came from, but they called all Africans Negroes. Very important to understand. So what we find in a sense is that the Africans were called Negroes because of the fact in a sense, Benjamin Franklin said that you should try to hook up with a red Indian, because if you hooked up with a red Indian, maybe in one generation, you could have some really light-skinned offspring that could be white. Okay. Then in a sense, and black offspring, it might take about 3 generations, even though it's some light-skinned blacks. Okay, so what happened is this. So in Virginia, right after they started chattel slavery among the African people, around 1670, I think that was when Virginia began to pass the first laws, where as late as 1680, really late. Maybe as early as not until the 1700s, they began to identify people as white people, and the black people, the Moors. They put the black people, the Moors, and the Indians. They labeled them in a sense as as blacks. Okay, so what you find is this. So in the 1680s, they began in a sense to refer to people as white people, and then by the early 1700s, 1705, 1707, they began to specifically put in the laws that the white man had more rights than the black people. They stopped referring to people based upon their nationality. Made it either Aboriginal. Okay. Now here's something that many of you may not know is that once they took the land away from these Aboriginal or Black Indians, they would label them. They would never label them as based upon their tribe. They would label them as free colored people. That's why if you look at the statistics, you see a steady increase in the number of free colored people. And so some people assume, the free colored people they were being free. No, nobody was being freed on the plantation. After in a sense, these Black Indians, once they were put on reservations, they had to pay taxes. And as they had to pay more and more taxes, then the white man took away their land. After the white man took away their land, then the white man will label them as free colored people. See,
So the classifications is, and how, like you said, not being named by your nationality and then being named by the social construct is
a
key
free
because
color.
even when we deal with our people from the diaspora, they don't. If you meet somebody from over there, they won't. They don't know what black means until they come into the United States because they know each other by their tribes.
Right.
All right, I
And
have some questions here for you, Doctor
yeah, go
Winters.
ahead.
Anybody have any more questions for Doctor Winters? We're gonna get to the ones I seen. Uh, Here's one. Have you heard of a serpent woman as sex slavery?
No, no. They do not, when you think about serpent women, I see them in a different light. When you think about serpent women, historically, serpent women, in a sense, were those people who practiced, the serpent religion over in Ireland. These were the Druids and all of them. They were considered serpent women because they were intermediaries between Nagasheen. Nagasheen is a serpent god, and he has his followers. I don't deal with Nagasheen, so I can't take too much. But they didn't call them serpent women. They just called them as they were just put in the brothels. And these Aboriginal women, they were just like any slave, any person in the brothel. They owned the people owned them. Then after they caught gonorrhea, syphilis, and they would usually die real quick because Europeans would spread a lot of syphilis around the world. You see, and so they didn't live too long. Just like breeding women, most black breeding women in Maryland, Kentucky, West Virginia, they didn't live too long either because they constantly had baby after baby after baby. Often they didn't really have time to build themselves up because just like you take a pit bull around and you take a pit bull and you continually have them have babies, after a while they get wore out. Same thing happened to breeding women. But no, I never heard of serpent women in terms of sex slavery. No, it was just they just had them in a brothel.
Wasn't there a tribe that believed that white folks were demons?
All the black tribes felt that white folks were demons. They didn't see them as human beings. That's why they never called them human beings. They saw them as pale faces. They saw them in a sense as very deceitful. They saw them as people you couldn't trust. But there was always these black people who would sometimes, some of our Aboriginal ancestors, they would sometimes feel if they joined with the Caucasians against other black people, they could become successful. And that's why we don't even know that's why these tribes don't exist today. So many black tribes killed each other off. The other black tribes were like this. Once the European, as I said, Benjamin Franklin wanted to have, in a sense, the Red Indians become the representative of the so-called Americans. See, the original Americans were the Black Indians, but beginning with Benjamin Franklin, they wanted to make the red man. So every time they took all the land away from the Black Indians, then they would get some red Indians and they would say, okay, now you pretend to be Cherokee, or you pretend to be Yuchi, you pretend to be Wichita. That's why you find all these red Indians. They're not the real, like, look at the Seminoles today. We know the Seminoles were mainly black people, but now the only Seminoles today are some red Indians. And that's because the white man allowed them to become identified off of your ancestry by giving them a card. You give them an identity card, and that card says that they're legit when they're not legit. See, when the first Indians came here, many people don't know this. When you think about gigantic herds of buffalo, you think about the Old West. Well, let me tell you something. When the Europeans came to North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, there was gigantic herds of buffalo. And the Red Indians, they followed the buffalo over to the eastern shore. Okay, so when they came, they were hunter-gatherers. All they knew how to do was hunt and fish and shit like that. And they lived in teepees. And so then, we felt sorry for them, our Cherokee, Cree, and Choctaw ancestors. They said, hey, you red man, you ain't got shit. Come and live in my town. And they let them come into town. They adopted them. See? And so then they adopted them, but they didn't understand that these people, we have no allies. So once we adopted these Red Indians, they always sold us out. Like the Yamasee, they had a confederation. They were about to, in a sense, they were about to run all white people out of Georgia and Florida. And then the Cherokee, the Red Cherokee, they turned on them. See, just like today, if you go to Oklahoma, the chiefs of the Cherokee, the Creek, they're all Caucasian or they're white. You see, but see that's because the fact, in a sense, is that we have no friends. We have, in a sense, no allies. But many of the Arapaho, Navajo, them were black. I know you guys have heard of David Imhotep. May he rest in power. He wrote a book on blacks in ancient America. He was a descendant of the Arapaho and the Navajo. Ho ho ho. But anyway, that's another story. But but again, in a sense, is that. But a lot of people used to get mad at David. A lot of people get mad at me because we always make sure to emphasize the fact that although the Black Irish, although the Aboriginals, although in a sense they were in America or they were in Ireland, their ancestors came from Africa. So we're African people. But see, these people are running away from being Africans because they feel if they don't identify as African, then that means that nobody will know that they were once a slave. It doesn't matter if you were once a slave. It doesn't matter, you see. You see these black people, they be going to powwows. And at the powwows, all the Indians, they get up and they, oh my, yo, nigga, get your ass out of here. But anyway, black people go to the powwows. And when these black people get up, even though they got Indian ancestry, but they don't have that card. They don't have the identification card. Sometimes, in a sense, the Red Indians will pull them off the field, saying, "What you out there dancing for? You're not Indian." But see, that's because they've been able to steal our heritage. See, they've been able to steal our heritage. Just like when you hear about the Iroquois Confederacy or the Muskogee Confederacy, the original Confederacy was of Black Indian tribes. But then later, in a sense, after the white man pushed the Indians off their land, or they killed most of them, then they made the red men be the representatives. See, the white man is always used, just like they use, in a sense, the Caribbean people and African people as tethers. They used to use the red Indian as a tether. They would use that red Indian to use them to, in a sense, to kind of separate themselves from us. And that's why you find all these Black Indian tribes. Now you see a lot of red people pretending that they're those Indian tribes. They're not the original Choctaw. They're definitely not the original Seminoles, but they got that card.
Was the Black Irish called Fomerians?
The Fomerians, that was a different group of people. I know one of my we were talking about that yesterday in my class. Well, me and our sister Shanice were teaching a class. And some of them were called Fomerians, but those Black Irish that came over here, they were not Fomerians. Most of them, in a sense, were elites. These were the people, in a sense, who they were the ones who built the castles. They were the ones who had the estates. David McRitchie, he writes about the winters, crooks. No, we just kicked ass. That's all. We just kicked ass. But see, they felt, in a sense, that, let me explain to you. Okay. Many of the Black Irish, they had became Catholics. Although they were Catholics, many of them married, they joined up with the Moors when the Moors were the Danes. When you hear about the Vikings, they taught you that the Vikings, in a sense, were some white guys who worshiped Thor and all that. No, the Vikings were Moors. They were black Moors. Duba. They were the Duba. Like Dublin. That means the black land. So they were Dubs. So they were blacks. And what happened? So they made it with these. And so that's why you find in much of the heraldry or the crest, you'll often find, in a sense, a black person with a Moorish handband, or you just see a black person, period. And see, most of these Irish elites, in a sense, they were forced to come over here as slaves. You see, some of them were even owned by people who in Ireland, in a sense, was able to take their land because, see, after Oliver Cromwell, after he conquered the Black Irish, after he killed about 200,000 or 300,000, then he sent 300,000 over here to the Caribbean and to North America, and they came over as chattel slaves. In fact, Oliver Cromwell said that we're sending you to be chattel slaves for perpetuity. He never expected those black people from the Caribbean, from Jamaica and from Montserrat going back to England. He thought they would always keep them there. And see, what the white man did is that. But see, the white man, when he wrote his books about ancient Britain, he would put in the books that they were little black people, or they were black this and black that. But see, they weren't afraid. They weren't afraid in the 1800s to put in the books about all these black Irish and these black in a sense Danes or these black Moors. They didn't. Why do you think they weren't afraid to put it in the book? Think about it. What was going on back in the 1800s between in terms of black people and white people and education? They made it against the law, remember? They would kill you. They would kill a white person who taught black people how to read, because they was telling the truth in those books, but they didn't want you to read those books and know that you were the ones who used to own the land. They didn't want you to know that you were in a sense the black Indians. They didn't want you to know that you were the black Irish. Look, as an indigenous people, you always have indigenous rights. You always have indigenous rights. See, therefore, they got on these boats that brought the black Irish over here as slaves. They got their names down. That means that you can find your name on that list of your family and you can do your genealogy. They owe you cash money. See, they not only owe many of us money, reparations for the suffering that our ancestors experienced over 250 years of slavery. They also owe you land and money over there in England, in Ireland. See, but see, the whole point is this: is that the people say, Dr. Winter, stop that. Dr. Winter, stop that. Dr. Winter, stop it, Q. Stop, Q. Let me tell him. Hey, Dr. Winter, stop. But anyway, they don't want you to know all this stuff. And then people, if you tell people that you got Irish ancestors, all that, then they want to laugh at you. Then they'll get on different channels and laugh at you, but you're not lying.
They tell you all types of coons and all types of names, and but you know your lineage. You could know your lineage all the way back, and somebody tell you that you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, like always, like my father was named Zenobia. I'm gonna answer this question in a minute. My father was named Zenobia. My great-grandfather and some of the other ones, they was named Clyde Winters. You go to Mississippi, you're going to find a whole lot of damn Clydes. You know if you've been there. And so I used to say to myself, how the hell did my father, I studied African history. That's why most of my books are on African history. I studied African history to the T. And I could never find no Zenobia. Then I found out that was from the Choctaw and some of the other Indian groups. Then I always wondered, how the hell did me and my grandparents, my grandfathers get the name Clyde? I said, where the hell that Clyde came from? But then when I studied history and started seeing, in a sense, that it was Irish called Clyde, the Clyde River. And then when I read, in a sense, MacRitchie's book, and he talked about the Winters clan over there, then I understood that I had maybe some black Irish. So then most of us, family, most of us have a tripartite origin. This tripartite origin comes from the fact that we have, in a sense, Aboriginal, Black Irish, and Sub-Saharan African ancestry. We carry all three, mostly all of us. We carry all three. That's why when you look at the Dawes list, is when they put down the names of all of the various Indian tribal members of the 5 civilized tribes. Creek. Then you see in there, you see Winters, you see Walker, you see McLean, you see McCoy, you see Crawford. That's how we got those names, because of that admixture on the plantation. See? And then people say, well, why didn't you call Walking Chief? And why didn't you call Big Nigger? That's because the fact is this is that we used, when I was growing up, everybody had a nickname. Sometimes you didn't even know the real name of your cousins until you got older, because they would call Boo Man, Booty, Black Man, Red Man, Fast, Cheetah, all that type of stuff. What about you, Quinn? Did a lot of people in your neighborhood have nicknames?
Yeah, I mean, I have family members that know the oral history, and like you said, they said we don't know nothing about slavery.
Yeah,
they'd be like, what are you talking about? And even Dr. Short went back to my great grandfather, born a freed man. He know nothing about slavery, came from Florida to Georgia, and so
But see, but they got to say that bill of goods, because see, if you had any agency, see, that means if you had played any role, just like they teach you in a sense that during the Civil War, the white man freed your ass. No, it was 200,000 black people, and many of them were former slaves. 200,000 black soldiers fought in the Civil War. America was losing. North America was losing. That's why Lincoln said they needed some fighters. They went into the Dismal Swamp. They went on those plantations. They said, hey, can you imagine? You had the opportunity to fight your master. You had the opportunity to fight the white man who'd been oppressing you. Oh, we kicked ass. That's why in the sense is that those dirty those red men. Why you just let me say that? During the Civil War, some of the Oklahoma Indians, they developed this black law, and the Oklahoma Indians that fought on the side of the Confederacy, under the black law, no black man could surrender. So I know you saw in the movie, Glory, when those black people lost and they was all killed, including the commanders. That was began by the Red Indians. The Red Indians, they started that. And so then black people did not surrender. And because black people couldn't surrender, we usually kick mucho ass. You see, one of the first special forces leaders, you won't believe this, one of the first special forces leader was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman
General
brothers, they kicked so much ass in North Carolina that they went to Congress and passed a law to stop that woman and those niggas from kicking that black ass. Yes, they burned down so many plantations in North Carolina and freed so many slaves that they wanted her in a sense out the army. That's why they didn't want to give Harriet Tubman her pension, because she kicked so much white ass during the Civil War. Yes, and that was a sister. See, I don't know. You don't ever hear about her being in special forces. You don't hear about her working behind the lines. Her and her 10 troops that followed her. They kicked mucho ass in North Carolina. They passed a law. They went to Congress. Get this black bitch out of here.
General Tubman, sir.
Yes, sir. That's right.
Does Dr. Winters have any knowledge about the Gucci mummies from Canary Islands? Mummies?
See, the Gucci mummies, just like the mummies that you find in Brazil, these are natural mummies. These mummies were naturally mummified by being in the sun and in the sand over a period of time. The Egyptians, in a sense, had formal mummification. Because they had formal mummification, they put chemicals and other things to make these bodies be preserved. But the Gachi mummies and the mummies in South America and Peru, these are mummies that were made through the natural causes, being in a desert environment and buried, and then they became mummified. Yes. Where does Pickaninny come from? Pickaninny, it doesn't come from the pits. Because see, the the Pits, the Pits, in a sense, they were absorbed. See, the Pits are very interesting, and because the Pits, when they talk about the Pits, they're mainly talking about the Iberians who came over to England, and they're mainly talking about the Anu people or the so-called Pygmy people. And so these Twa people, they were mainly the Picts, but then sometimes they get the Picts mixed up with the Celts, the Celts. But they're not related to the Pickaninny. Pickaninny, just looking at the word Pickaninny, you look at Ninny, it probably has something to do with women because, see, as I told you before, many of the people who were made slaves in North America mainly came from the Senegambia. Many of them, in a sense, because they were Mandi speakers, and the word for woman or mama in Maninka is nani, and so a lot of times, in a sense, you would say nani, then the woman would put her breast, because the name for the mother and the breast was nani. So Pickaninny may have came from that.
Someone asked Dr. Winters, I'm looking for that question. I know
Your brother, he's named Clyde. Clyde means he was heard from afar. In other words, a lot of you people, a lot of y'all out there getting mad at me. You're saying Dr. Winters talking that ish. But I'm going to tell you this is that my name Clyde means he was heard afar. So even though right now you're not understanding, you're going to wake up tomorrow and you're going to say, oh, damn, that's what that Igga said. Oh, that's what that old Igga said. Yes, I'm Uncle Clyde. Uncle Clyde on the plantation down by the way, singing my song every day. Let this old nigga come to your house. Let me tell you what to do, and we'll find a little spot. Let me go and fish it. Is there a curriculum on this topic? No. But
what do you mean it ain't no curriculum on this topic, and you are a history elder?
Well, I haven't written the curriculum yet. But you can, if you want to find more information about these people who came from Ireland, you can get my book, Blacks in Europe from Prehistory to Contemporary Times. You can get that book, and you can get my book on Afro-American history up until 1899 or something like that. I can't remember the title, but you can go to Amazon.com and you can find my book on Afro-American history. And in there, I talk about these black people who came over here. I talk about the various people. You are the brain. Yes, I am that brain. You know what they call the brain, don't you? You know what they call the brain? They call the brain the superior nigra. Because your brain is black, so they call your brain the superior nigra. So I guess you can call me that super nigga. Wow! Y'all saw.
At Dr. Winters Afrocentric History site, what do you think of the mummies said to have been found in the Grand Canyon?
Okay, that's very complicated. I'm going to tell you this. If you're interested in that inquiry, I have a live broadcast on the Egyptians found in the Grand Canyon. Go to my YouTube page and you'll find it. This is that many other people in a sense, they dispute the fact that these were Egyptians because they claim that there was a picture of Buddha. But see, many people don't know is that Buddhism did not begin in India. Buddhism began in Kush. And in fact, when you read the Ramayana, when you read the Mahabharata, when you read the Puranas, the Pasi, when you read the Indian literature, you discover in a sense that Buddha came from the Nile Valley, and that most of the early Buddhists were Blimies, and that's what they used to call the people who lived in ancient Ethiopia, Blimies. See, and so I got a book on the African origin of the Buddhists. Buy that book and you'll learn more about it. Plus, I have a video on my website. On my website, I have almost 300 videos on all aspects of Black history. 300 videos. You know.
What y'all asking Dr. Winter this question is for? What does Dr. Winters think about the cocaine found in the Pharaoh tomb?
Okay, what it is that that's one of the reasons that we know that there was some trade between the pharaohs and, in a sense, the people in the ancient Americas. We know, in a sense, that coca was used for two purposes. It was used for medicinal purposes. It was also used so that people could become in contact with they could get high and they could go into contact. You know, just like I was looking at Black Magic 393, I think it is, and so this sister, she was talking about traveling. Well, see, back in the day, people traveled to the distant planets. They didn't have to take a rocket. Often they would sit in a pyramid or sit in a cave and they would meditate, and then they would get out of their body, their astral self, and their astral self would travel to the different planets and stuff like that.
Yeah, you guys in the chat, I see all the questions coming up. I'm gonna start them, and I'm glad that everybody wants to get all this information out of Dr. Winters right now. It's a good thing. What is the origin of Black slave dialect as written in the style of the Kunti Cullen?
Okay, that dialect is based upon the fact, in the sense that it's a voice that we had because of the fact, in the sense, it made white people feel good. See, when we got around white people, we say Yaza Baza, we be over there. We knows what that you like to do, boss. We's going to get it done. And then these Black people, when they home, they would talk standard English. But see, Black English, in a sense, was based upon the fact is that, let me explain to you. Black English or Ebonics is based upon speaking the English language, but we have what's called a Niger-Congo. We have a Niger-Congo grammar. So we produce our sentences different, you see. For example, instead of saying, I left, I went to the store, we would say, I went to the store. I've dropped the T. We never pronounce double consonants. And so in this language, in a sense, this English is an English that's based upon our origins. Plus, you got to remember is that if the Picts, if the Baradanacs, those are the people, if the Baradanacs and Picts spoke English, then English is an African language, because those were Black people who invented that language. Haven't you ever noticed? Let me give you an example. I know you guys saying, what the hell is this nigga talking about? Tell you what I'm talking about. Who are the greatest speakers of the English language today? You don't find one white person known as an eloquent speaker of English. The people known as the greatest speakers of English today include who? Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Jesse Jackson, and nobody can top James Earl Jones. And in the past, we had Paul Robeson. See, we take English and we make it sound good. We take English and we make it rhyme. Jack be nimble, Jack be quick. I saw it could go up a tree and come down and But anyway, that's another story. So English, in a sense, is really an African language.
Dr. Winters, what do you think about the hairy wild men of Europe?
Well, the hairy wild man of Europe, that relates to the fact is that right now, later, anybody, I want you to go to your Google and put in there the wild men of Europe. And what they're going to show you these white people attacking a castle. And in this castle, they've got all these Black people. You know, the king, queen are up in the top. And then you see the Black people around shooting arrows down at the wild man. The wild man was a term relating to, in a sense, the white barbarians that lived in Europe, who were, in a sense, trying to attack the various Moorish castles. See, those castles built in Britain, those castles built in Europe, they weren't built by no white people. They were built by Black people, as I told you earlier. You see, you're right, D. False. The FBA are the best orders. As I told you before, you see, these people, in a sense, they were the architects. They built London. They built London Bridge. Black people built that bridge, not white people. Don't get it twisted. Yeah, Minister Farrakhan, he's good too. You know.
Well, folks, with that, we want to thank Dr. Winters for coming on. I try to have Dr. Winters on as much as possible. I have been sick. And, Dr. Winters also has his own channel on YouTube, which a lot of his audience is here participating. Appreciate you guys. And all I can say is um, he's our historian, he's our elder, and we need to take advantage of him while he's still accessible to us. Dr. Winters, tell us about some of your books and how can we get them?
Well, I've got about 40 books. I've really written about 50, but I've got about 40 books, and these books you can order them on Amazon.com. And these books, they detail the history of Black people in Africa, Black people in Europe, Black people around the world. I got a book on the blacks of history of the blacks in China and all that type of good stuff.
Y'all hear his ringtone?
I got that ringtone because I got children, and these children, they always calling me about something, and it's usually about lending them money. So it's spooky. So I've got about 40 books, and these books are on all aspects. My latest book, in a sense, is called Law and Nationality of Foundational Black Americans. In my book, Law and Nationality, what I talk about, in a sense, is how the Aboriginal Black people moved from being called blacks to colored people, then to freemen, and now today, foundational Black Americans. Get that book, Law and Nationality. The book, in a sense, it's on Amazon.com. You can buy any of my books. I wrote a book on the world history of Black people. In my book, The World History of Black People. In this book, I talk about every Black civilization on every continent. And then I wrote a book called The Atlantis in Mexico. My book, Atlantis in Mexico, I'm talking about the Neo-Atlanteans. And the Neo-Atlanteans are the Olmec people, because the Olmec people came from Africa. I explained how the Olmec people, they not only came from Africa, but they brought pyramid building, This Thursday, come to my channel at 3 p.m. Central Time. I'm gonna do my presentation this week on Thursday is going to be, in a sense, on America is not the old world. In this particular presentation I'm going to do on Thursday at 3 p.m. Central Time, I'm going to talk about all this stuff about America being the Old Testament, being Israel, all that type of stuff, that we came from Pangea. I'm going to discuss all those things and show how that's all ish, you see. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m., I want you guys to join me on my YouTube channel, and I'm going to be talking to Eve. If Eve is very popular, I know, on Instagram. She's been working with Tariq Nasheed. She works with Juan B. And anybody who listens to those late night talks on Twitter, which I don't listen to. I listen to them in the morning. I don't stay up that late. But so join me tomorrow night. Me and Eve tomorrow night, we're going to talk about, is love a state of mind?
Hey, Donald, I see your question in the chat. All you got to do is go on YouTube and Dr. Winters' channel will pop right up if you put his name up there.
Yeah, it's the Afrocentric history site.
Dr. Winters, also, could you reiterate to your audience as well as my audience your class that you teach?
Well, I teach a class on research, and in my research class, I teach people how to do research. I've had 4 classes, and some of the people who've taken my class, they've written books, they've written articles. What it is that my class teaches you how to do research, and it allows you. A lot of people want to tell their story. A lot of people want to write about Black people, or they want to write drama, they want to write history, or they want to do research, and so I teach them how to do the research. I was quite surprised this week. Some of the students in my first class, they sent me a beautiful chain, and they sent an amulet with the chain, and it's got my name in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it made me feel really good that these were people in my first class, Deborah, Beckett, Kamit, chemist, and Cheryl, And all of you guys, I know I missed a couple of names, but it makes you feel good. And it makes me feel good too, is that these people who took my research class, now they're doing research. Now they're writing books, they're writing articles, they're doing music. Yoshi Mod, he was in my class too. And I know Yoshi Mod and Q, they made me famous on TikTok. Yoshi Mod and Q, they put so many videos up of me talking on TikTok.
On TikTok, we it's funny because that's how me and him met. I put a couple clips up on TikTok. He commented, we met. Now I see him with you doing shows, which is a great thing. Also, you guys, Dr. Winters has a book on homeschooling for foundational Black Americans. And even if you don't have small children, you may have small grandchildren. It's very important that going forward that we think about homeschooling our kids. And I think that this book gives it an idea whether we should do it or not, because I think a lot of people jump into it and don't realize what you have to do prior.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people may have cold feet and don't want to do it because they think it's too much. So Dr. Winters has a lot of books, you guys. He's very accessible to all of us. And I think that we should really, really, really appreciate, give our elder his flowers while he's here. Take advantage. He's always answering. He's an emailer. So if you email him, he's going to respond. He's written countless articles.
Yeah.
Appreciate Dr. Winters for joining us tonight. Appreciate everybody in the chat. Remember, the best way to support the channel is to like, share, subscribe both channels. And great conversation, Dr. Winters. Appreciate you. Thanks for coming on. And everybody have a blessed night. Take care.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a great night. Bye.
What have you done for me lately? It's Coons. What have y'all done for us lately? And if there's no answer, the only thing we owe them